Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Centre, and this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action, sponsored by Small Church Connections here in Canada. I look forward today to our time together with a very special guest. This is a fellow I've known for a little while, and I'm going to get to know him a lot more today, and I'm looking forward to that. So I invite you just to sit back and listen a bit as we talk. I won't give away the whole thing, but we're going to talk about long-term pastoral ministry. And after that, we'll see where we go. But first, I'm just going to ask our guest, Kevin, to tell us who he is, what's your name, what's your ministry journey been over the last number of years, and that'll kick us off, and we'll go on from there. Take her away, Kevin.
Okay, well, you gave my name to begin with. My name's Kevin Roberts. I'm pastor of Fort Macleod Alliance Church in southern Alberta here. Mm-hmm. So I've been pastoring for 25 years, but in many ways I feel very ill-equipped for this topic because I wouldn't have described myself as a long-term pastor. Rather, it's kind of a topic that began to interest me to explore. Mm-hmm. What's involved in that and what gets in the way of being a long-term pastor. And so I've pastored. This is my fourth church I've pastored in 25 years. Mm-hmm. And we're plugging along.
All right. Well, let me ask you a quick question. Sure. You say there's four churches. Where have those churches been situated?
Well, my first church was in southern Manitoba. Mm-hmm. So Somerset, Manitoba. I pastored a small Associated Gospel church there. It was my first church after college. Mm-hmm. It was a bivocational ministry. So I worked, I'd like to say part-time, but I don't think there is such a thing as a part-time church. I worked full-time with the church, and then I worked at other jobs outside of that. And, mm-hmm. Went from there, and I pastored Coronach Alliance Church in southern Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
And again, was bivocational there. And that was an Alliance church. Then I went to northern Saskatchewan, and I was in Big River, Saskatchewan, an evangelical free church.
That's a beautiful area up there. I love Big River. It
is, yeah. Carry lots of bug spray with you. But,
definitely.
it was a beautiful area, yeah. Mm-hmm. So, and then now I'm pastoring an Alliance church again in southern Alberta, and this would be the first place I haven't been bivocational. So, as far as small church ministry, I spent 19 years being bivocational, and that was good. I mean, I miss it many days. So,
yeah, there's as you may know, there's a recent book been published. James Watson is one of the authors, and a number of others, just on tent making. And I've just finished. I'm just in the midst of reading it through. I've of course talked with James and a number of others on the whole bivocational, multivocational ministry. That isn't what this podcast is supposed to be about, but we may venture into that because that may become part of the thoughts on long-term ministry as well. Okay, so let's ask the question: sure. What do you consider to be long-term ministry?
Well, I think that's a question that's subject to some variability. Part of my thinking with this is with a book that I was reading when I was preparing for a workshop that I was a part of, and the book was by a pastor by the name of Rich Brown, called Extended Stays, a closer look at longer pastorates.
Yeah.
And he kind of researched what you should call that long and short. And his definition that he used for his book was that short-term ministry was anything less than 5 years, mm-hmm. and long-term ministry was anything 9 years and more. So is what he did. So there's this area between 5 and 8 years. Mm-hmm. Where we're not quite sure what we are. And that's
you're just floating in the ocean or something. I don't know.
That's right. Yeah.
Which makes for an interesting thought. 9 years or more is definitely a stretch, and a longer term. I know for myself, one pastoral ministry was 10 years and another one 11 years that I've been involved in as far as long-term ministry. Tough stuff to get to that point and to work with it. What kind of a person, what characteristics would you talk about the person who thrives for the long term?
I think you've got to love the people and love the church.
Yeah.
Love the community. But there's some obstacles, and I think that part of what intrigued me with the subject and looking at it is I mean, if you've been in pastoral ministry for more than a week and a half, then you've either heard or you've been part of some of the horror stories, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
and some of the challenges. And so what intrigued me is we often look at the obstacles to ministry as being the church's obstacles,
Yeah.
what the church has done and the issues in the church. But there are also obstacles within us. We
Mhm.
bring our own dysfunctions to the pastorate. We bring our own neediness. We bring our own issues, and I I've really come to believe that some of those things really filter into whether or not we're staying longer in the places we're at, or whether we're leaving sooner.
Mhm. Okay, let's jump into that a little further and just ask the question. So what are those particular dysfunctions? Can you name one or two just right off the top of your head for us pastors that we should be looking for?
I think as I've talked to people, I mean, a lot of our churches have experienced a lot of conflict in the last, well,
Oh.
2,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be conflict is a big part of our experience within churches, and some of that conflict is stuff within us. We like to be liked.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants to be the hero of the story. We have a difficult time owning when we've done it wrong,
Yeah.
or when there's attitudes within us. I mean, many of us have a sense of neediness within us that we would find difficult to admit. Um, but sometimes we look for those we minister to fill that.
Yeah.
We look for their affirmation, and when we go through seasons when that's not there, we don't always recognize that it's not just within the church issue. Sometimes it's within us, and there's
Mhm.
something that God needs to dig into deep down within us that has to do with where we're filled when it comes to our sense of ministry and sense of fulfillment.
Okay, that makes me ask the next question when I think of the characteristics of the pastors. Now let's jump to the church. What kind of how do you get to long-term ministry in a church? What does the church need to be preparing for, doing?
Um, yeah, I mean, I broke it down into three different categories for
Okay.
obstacles, and the first one that I had to do with the pastor's family.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there are legitimate issues within the family that whether it be health issues or otherwise, that require you to you can't stay.
Yeah.
So for instance, in one of the churches I pastored, we were in a fairly remote setting, and I had a family member. My daughter got seriously ill, and coming out of that, we had doctors and teachers tell us that we needed to be closer to a larger center
Mm.
for the long term. So personally, I find it hard to build a house I'm not gonna live in. And
Yeah.
so for me, I knew that in that pastorate, I had an expiration date there, and so I
Mhm.
knew that my heart needed to shift to look elsewhere because of needs in my family. And that was one of, you have to look at whether you can answer those obstacles there or not.
Yeah.
Within the church, sometimes short-term pastorates are self-fulfilling prophecies. I remember in my first church, I couldn't figure out why everyone was treating me different at around the 3-year mark. It just seemed all the relationships seemed to change. And again, because it was my first church, you're learning all your mistakes the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I began to realize we were still part of a culture where it seemed pastors shifted around every 3 years.
Very much, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there were people in the congregation preparing for that to take place at the 3 year mark. It didn't,
Mhm.
but for me, I had to adjust kind of and figure out what was going on with these relationships. And yeah.
It is funny that you would mention that. I was working with a colleague in the early 90s. He was doing studies, his doctorate, and part of that was on long-term ministry. Brian Berglez prepared and did a whole project on that for his doctoral. And it was interesting that his take was at that point, yes, we're all set to live with 2 to 3 years, but we haven't gotten past that. Our society doesn't Christian churches and society doesn't seem to expect you to be there longer. Has that changed? Are we more open to long-term pastors?
I think we are. I think we are. It's just speculative on my part, but I think maybe it's a little slower to work itself out in some of the more rural settings,
Mm-hmm.
for a variety of reasons. But I see pastors staying longer in places, and I hear much more talk about staying longer. Right? I mean, most of the studies that you have on this kind of thing talk about your best years of ministry being between the years of 8 and 12 at a church.
Yeah.
And yet many pastors never reach the start of what many suggest are your most fruitful years in a congregation. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's shifting.
Yeah, it's interesting, the latest report, the Significant Church report that's come out of, well, been done by Rick Heemstra, and her name's escaping me, working with a number of church denominations and with the small church connections, says that you basically can't see long-term ministry in a small church unless you have a congregational covenant that works with the idea of the church realizes you're going to be faithful to the founding covenants, documents that started it, but also that their trust only builds over time. And so you can't expect small churches to thrive unless they have that kind of a covenant. Would you see that? Do you understand that in some of your pastoring? How have you seen that continue to grow into your own understanding of that? You have to be faithful to the founding covenants, but trust over time if you're going to see change in the church and the church continue to thrive.
I think I mean I just started reading that report, if it's the same one that
Yes,
came out a
I'm
few
sure it
days
is.
ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't finished it yet. Um, for me, that was a new thought, the idea of figuring out what the founding covenant is, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that even the local church itself would see itself in those terms. What its founding covenant was. Um, so it'll be interesting to see how that thought might play itself out in churches as they have discussions going forward.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting just to see. Um, I pastored a church where I was literally born into the church, carried into the church the next day or two after I was born, left for a while, came back, served as youth pastor, left, and then came back as the lead pastor and retired. And I am retired and still attending that same church. The covenant is in the back of my mind, and I know some of the people, but the people have changed. And so
Mhm.
is that founding covenant still there? What have you found? Do you think small churches stick to a founding covenant, or do things change over time?
I'm not convinced that, and again, I think where it's there, it'll come out in conversations going forward. The small churches and particularly rural churches are largely about relationship,
Mm-hmm.
and largely it's long-term relationships that provide the stability and backbone and core of a church. You've got a portion that kind of move in and out of the community over the years, but there's usually a number of stable families and long-term relationships there. remember, I think it was one of Steve Beerley's books, if I remember right, talking about when a pastor comes to a church, particularly a small rural church, he is probably the most influential outsider that comes into the church. And I think that's part of the need for time. And most pastors, or many pastors, don't reach that. Is you struggle to get past that sense of being an outsider within a church, and until you can pass that mark wherever it is in a church, and I don't know, I wasn't a pastor at the time. My wife and I lived in a small town in Davidson, or in Saskatchewan for a little
Yeah.
while, Davidson, Saskatchewan,
Mm-hmm.
where I was working. And I remember talking to a person in the neighborhood and saying, "Oh, so how long have you been here?" And he says, "Oh, I haven't been here very long. I've only been here 20 years."
Yeah.
And so that was your sense. Unless you were, your length of time and your heritage in a community has a lot to do with how how you click, how you're part of that community. And when pastors come in from the outside, uh, I think people are excited to see them, but people are a little cautious because that outsider poses some degree of threat.
Yeah, and which comes back to that question of trust over time. In
Yeah.
order to see change in the church and to be a long-term pastor, you have to have trust over time.
Yeah.
This past week, I watched as my brother-in-law gave his uh, resignation speech to his church. He came 37 years prior and spent
Wow.
37 years in that one church. Interesting to watch his life, and to see some of, maybe how he survived, how he lived, and became part of that community. Is there, if you were to look to your own background and some of the people that you've worked with or known over the years as long-term pastors, what would stick out in your mind about the way they approached their ministry, their pastorate?
Patience.
Patience, eh? Okay.
Patience. And I think maybe it's part of what comes out of leaving Bible school, where you come out as a young guy thinking you're going to change the world. You got all these ideas, and sometimes it's the promotion of what larger churches and larger church culture thinks a small church should do, and that gets influenced on the young pastor. You go into places and then you hit the obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
You hit the roadblocks that are going to take a long time before you see anything to change. And I think the question is, there's some obstacles that you're going to experience in any church, but particularly smaller rural churches. Am I willing to wait it out?
Yeah.
Am I willing to do the hard work of just loving people and being present in their lives, taking some of the lumps that come along the way, and just wait it out until that time comes that you can see some of the constructive change.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the other thing I would add to that is maybe sometimes as pastors we're so much into change that we don't celebrate what is, and that's one of the mistakes pastors make when they go into a new church, is rather than celebrate the ministry that has already been there and the hard work of what's often many lay leaders that have been there through so much, rather than celebrate that and celebrate them, we go in there and start to think, oh, this should be different and that should be different.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do that, this and that. And I think part of our starting foundation ought to be just taking some time to celebrate and honor those often long-term lay leaders and families that have kept that ministry going long before you were there, and in some cases, long after you're gone.
And I suppose that is another part of a long-term ministry is understanding that um, many small churches, they have had leadership there that has lasted through how many pastors?
Yeah.
And so when you come and you're desirous of being a long-term pastor, you've got to show in some way that you're going to stick around because they've seen this, they've been there, they've done that. How would you show that you're going to stick around?
I'm not sure how you show it. I think you just have to do it.
Do it. Okay.
Um, I mean, every church has some of its. Well, I think every church, and I use the Corinth church in the Bible as my example for it. I think every church has its dysfunctional DNA that is often reflective of the community or demographics it's been saved out of.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to know what some of the goofy things in the church are, take a look at the community around it and see what people are being saved out of. And I think you'll see some of those reflected in the life and the struggles of the church. And if you're going to be there and gain trust to lead into things over time, you've got to decide if you're willing to wait it out.
Mm-hmm.
And
maybe willing to spend a little time doing research and understanding a community. If you come in with a set, this is how the church looks, and you don't actually look at the church, then you're in trouble. At least that, I don't know. I guess that's sort of my take on a lot of that. Yeah.
And even honoring the values. I mean, many times as pastors, and we're coming from a different culture.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely.
I mean, I don't know how many times I have seen over the years, a small church in Western Canada calling a larger church pastor from out east to come and serve there because they're looking for something specific, and the pastor doesn't fit with the culture. And unless the pastor can respect the fact that some of the things he brings into it are different, and maybe some of the things that they have there are actually more appropriate to the culture, you run into trouble, right? So my experiences in the different places I have been have a natural culture within me that might be different in some cases, at least in some areas, than the church that I'm a part of. And it's not necessarily a better or worse thing. Sometimes it's just different.
Yeah. And one of the things a fellow by the name of Dr. Peter Ralph mentioned at one point to me, he says, when your story is their story, then you'll have a long history.
Okay.
And I think
like
that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm looking at our time and we're coming pretty close to the end here. Let me just finish with one question. If you had one piece of advice for an aspiring small church pastor, perhaps just out of school or looking at going into ministry, as they contemplate that and look to be long-term pastors, what one piece of advice would you give them?
I would say when you look within yourself, and I'm just beginning to learn and discover this, that the three big obstacles within ourself to staying longer someplace, I would say one is forgiveness. We preach and talk a lot about forgiveness, but have I learned to forgive those who have hurt me in ministry? I mean, if in the place I'm at, I can't learn to forgive those who have hurt me, I'm not going to stay. And that's conflict is one of the big things that take us out. Along with that, to learn to grieve, to recognize we have losses and to learn to grieve them, and be able to deal with those things within ourselves if we're going to be able to stay.
Yeah. Yes, the last point that you make, my own personal life, I've lived through grief in a number of situations, from the passing of my first wife to the grieving of a church that was once large and yet still has had various decreases for different reasons, and grieving the loss of many relationships. That's a very hard one.
People are going to leave our ministries. I mean, people left Jesus. People walked away from Jesus, right? And if they walked away from Jesus, we shouldn't be surprised that they're going to walk away from our churches and our ministries. And that hurts. It's hard, and sometimes we're left with a lot of questions, and yeah, that can be very difficult. But if we don't learn to grieve those losses, and we
Yeah.
don't learn to forgive those who hurt us, then we're just going to look for the next field to go into so that we can reinvigorate our sense of passion.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if we haven't learned to forgive and to grieve those losses and those injuries, we're just going to repeat the cycle in the next place.
Yeah. Good, great points. And I appreciate very much your thoughts on long-term ministry and some of the other rabbit trails I've gone down. I appreciate that you've gone with me. We want to thank you very much for just spending time with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Ron.